Okay, I want to extend a hugely warm welcome to Frank Cespedes, professor at Harvard Business School, author and sales practitioner leader. I've known of Frank for quite some time now because he's such a respected figure in the sales education kind of area. And I'm delighted that Frank has accepted an interview to join us on the Sales Podcast channel that we're running here. So, Frank, thank you very much for joining us.
Phil, it is my pleasure. Thank you very much for that gracious introduction. In my case, flattery will get you everywhere.
Right. Well, it's fully deserved, I think, because it helps to elevate the kind of profession when we have people, with your experience and background, sort of flying the flag of sales, practice. And I know a bit about your background, Frank, but I just wonder, before we get stuck into the kind of podcast itself, or as part of the podcast, could you just perhaps fill us in with a little bit about your background and why have you taken so much of an interest in this area
Well,
of sales practice?
my background is not particularly exotic. I went to graduate school, got my doctorate, started teaching at Harvard's Business School, made my way up the hierarchy, and then I left with some others. We started a firm. I ran that firm for 10 years, and we got lucky. When need be, I can spin this a different way. But the truth was, it was luck. We sold at exactly the right time. Harvard called me back up, said, "How'd you like to be a professor again?" And in terms of how I got interested in sales, my original research in academia was about distribution channels. And if you're going to talk about go to market, you're going to talk about sales. So it led to that. And then, of course, when I left and ran a business, believe me, the necessity to make payroll every month makes you deeply interested in business development and sales. So, again, not particularly exotic, but that's my route to the top.
I would love to learn more about the experience you had actually moving from academia to running a business. I mean, and you talk about cash flow as being something that becomes very kind of relevant. But do you mind just sharing a bit more about the reality of running a company
Yeah.
and yeah.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I think first of all, and as you know, I've written about this. It's not just one reality. All right, it is multiple realities, especially when it comes to sales. I ran a professional services firm. That's different. Selling there is different than when you're selling software or consumer durables or whatever. So that's number one. But number two, what I do think is sort of generic when you move from the so-called ivory tower to, scare quotes, the real world. Every executive I've ever met thinks they're living in the real world and everyone else is not. At a certain point, you need some humility and experience. But what you find out is what salespeople find out if and when they ever try to become sales managers. All right. You have to learn how to take care of others and get things done through others. If you don't learn that, you're only as good as your arms can reach. And in fact, you are an impediment to growth. You're not accelerating growth. Secondly, people are very, very complex. One of the topics I know you want to talk about is compensation. It is very important. Someone who tells you that the way people get paid doesn't affect their behavior is living in Disney World. However, what you also find out is that compensation is a necessary but not sufficient cause of getting the behaviors you want because people are complex. And then the third thing, and this is something I find I still need to preach, to very smart, well-educated senior executives. When you're in the world, you learn very quickly that the world has absolutely no responsibility to adapt to your company, your strategy, your goals. The world will do what the world will do for many, many reasons that are outside of your control. It's your responsibility as a business person or a salesperson to adapt to the real world. Life is unfair in that respect, but that's the way it works. So those would be the things I'd say about that transition.
Yeah. Oh, it's so interesting to learn about your background. And just by contrast, my background is almost completely the opposite to yours, which is, I left school and didn't want to go to university. So I didn't educate myself properly, went into sales, found myself working for quite a large consulting practice, set up my own company. And then I accidentally fell into doing a doctorate myself at the age of 45 and actually realized how powerful a process it is to get that kind of critical reflection as an opportunity to reflect back on what you're doing in the practical world. And I just think this combination of what you learn through being an academic as well as what you learn from doing something is a fantastically powerful combination, which is why I think marrying those two concepts together, as we've been doing now through the Sales Business School at Consalia, is really important. But let's just come to the kind of area that I'd really like to focus in on, because you're someone with such a vast amount of experience in sales. But for the benefit of our listeners, Frank has written a book called Sales Management That Works. And I'm going to show this book here for viewers to see if George manages to get the video clip out there. But I'm really interested in the title. I mean, Sales Management That Works. And I've always said inside our company, it doesn't matter what we do, but whatever we do, it's got to work. So immediately the title kind of struck me. So here we're talking about sales management practices based on research that Frank has done that works. Yeah. So this is a book that's not academic to read at all. And in fact, it's very practical. And Frank, do you mind if I just explain to the listeners the basic structure of the book, and because we're going to hone in on a couple of details, but essentially the book is split into three parts: people, process, pricing, and partners. And when I read the book, and I was thinking, there's so many sort of case studies and anecdotes, and I mean, clearly written by someone who has not only researched it but done it. I felt, well, I can't cover the entire book here, but I just want to focus in on a couple of the sections of the book. And if we're lucky, we might get Frank to come back and share us some more of his insights, apart from the two topics we shall cover. So I don't know if you want to explain a bit how you came to structure the book as you did, Frank, before we hone in on hiring and compensation as the two key topics for today.
Well, I mean, maybe I'll start one step even before that, and that is why
Okay.
write the book? I mean, Phil, as you know, it's not like the world is waiting breathlessly for yet another book about sales, right?
Correct.
If you go to Amazon and go to the book section and in the keywords put in sales management, out will come over 80,000 stock keeping units. The only management topic that gets more is, quote, leadership, gets about 90,000, but sales is a close second. So, I think any author who writes in this area should be asked the question, why have you contributed to this tsunami? All right, because that's what it is. And I had two motivations. One I've already articulated. Sales is by far the most context dependent part of business. Depends on what product you're selling. It depends where and to whom you're selling. Selling in North America is different than selling in Europe or in Asia or the Middle East, etc. And yet it's an area where people feel for some reason confident to make these huge generalizations, usually unsupported by any evidence beyond what in academia we would call N equals 1. When
Yeah.
I worked for Oracle 15 years ago, here's what worked for me, and I'm sure it will work for you.
Yeah.
Precisely because it's so specific and susceptible to these generalizations, I wanted to write a book after doing years of research about this. Here's what research does and does not tell you about what works in this area and what does not. All right. The second motivation for the book, I think it's a good time for a book like that. There's no doubt whatsoever that digital online technologies are affecting buying and selling. But most of what I read about that is simply not supported by the empirical data. So I wanted to write a book that gets at that as well. And then, in direct answer to your question, I think, what we're talking about here is not writing a Shakespeare play or a philosophical tome. We're talking about writing a book that business practitioners can use. Business is a performance art. An idea that does not work in business is not called a great idea. It's called failure. So, what's the point of writing or reading a business book if it's not practical and actionable, but also, one hopes, supported by research, not, if I can be irreverent, this kind of blowhard opinions that basically dominate most management talk, especially sales talk.
Yeah. Do you know what's interesting? And I wasn't planning on reflecting on this, but you made me want to ask this question, is that I found when I was doing my doctorate, when you start to look at the academic publications that's available on the specific topic of sales, um, compared to the academic journals, for example, about marketing,
Yeah.
there are very few. It's almost the opposite. I think that, there's one or two that are particularly dedicated to sales, maybe over 100, 150, I don't know, on marketing related topics.
Yeah.
I was
Well,
just looking at this.
there are systemic reasons for that, and it's changing. The systemic reasons have to do with the reward system in academia. You don't get promoted in academia for having great ideas simply that people adopt. You get promoted by publishing in the peer journals, and essentially that means analyzing big data sets. That's historically marketing, not sales.
Yeah.
Secondly, sales is a very difficult topic to train for in academia. Academia is an especially extreme version of the division of labor. Sales is about buying. In that sense, marketing is relevant. It's about economics. It's about psychology. One of the best books ever written about sales wasn't written by a sales professor. It was written by Cialdini, his book on persuasion.
Yeah.
So it's about psychology. Again, as a junior professor, that sort of cross-functional interdisciplinary work is usually a recipe for not getting promoted. So those are the reasons, but it's changing. And one of the reasons it's changing is the data revolution. The data revolution is now making sales an area where, like marketing historically, you can look at big data sets. And secondly, in schools in particular, the dramatic interest, the increase in interest in entrepreneurship, this, entrepreneurship, that's good for sales. You do not have to work hard to convince a would-be entrepreneur that she should know something about sales and selling. So again,
Yeah.
it's not a coincidence. It's not like academics wake up in the morning and say, oh, sales, the heck with that. There are systemic reasons for it.
Yeah. Well, that's given me hope because I think it's from our experience of working with universities and talking about sales. You often you get the comment sales. Well, that's a submodule of marketing. That's about as far as it goes. Uh, uh, but I do think we're changing things. The UK, I think, has done some amazing things to government supported as well to get sales on the agenda. So anyway, let's move back to the book, Sales Management That Works. So I've asked Frank whether or not we could just focus in on two chapters, and one of the chapters is hiring, and the other is on compensation. And you could argue that the two are kind of interconnected as well. You know, compensation and hiring is important. Compensation and retention is important as well. But I'd just like to get from you, Frank, just your take on hiring. I mean, you make some really interesting comments in your book about, the costs are really high. We got to get it right. So I'm just going to hand over the floor to you, Frank, just to talk us through
Yep.
your points of view about hiring, some of the things to avoid doing, some of the things to do. What have been some of the practices that you've researched around hiring that seems to work and reflected in this
Yeah.
chapter in your book?
Well, first, Phil, I think you're right. They are interconnected. I mean, think about it. The nature of the compensation system will also affect not only who you hire, but who is and is not interested in being hired, right? There are people that welcome high commission plans, others who don't. And it works the other way. The people you hire determine what does and doesn't work in the reward system. Now, that said, what we're talking about here is sales hiring. And I think it's first important to recognize that there have always been challenges in sales hiring that simply do not exist to the same extent in other business functions. And it goes back to your previous comments about academia. If you want to hire an engineer, you can go to a school, and it's a bit like walking into a food court. What kind of engineer do you want? Civil engineering, electrical engineering, etc. Same is true if you want to hire someone in finance or accounting, or for that matter, in computer programming. You can find people who majored in those topics. That is, generally speaking, not true in sales. The United States is a good example. And by the way, this is an area where the United States is actually better than the United Kingdom or Europe. When I started writing the book you're kind enough to mention, of the more than 4,000 colleges and universities in the United States, less than 300 even offered a sales course, let alone a sales program. So this is an area where the vast majority of people start out knowing very, very little about what they're going to get paid for. You've got to grow your own. So that's, sort of insight number one
Yeah.
about hiring. Secondly, one of the oldest aphorisms in business is when people complain, remember, you hired your problems. That is true in sales. So you need to pay attention to it. And you'll see the data in the book. If you look at the amount of money that companies spend on hiring, training and development, and sales, sales gets 20% more per capita spent on training than any other business function. The issue is not do companies spend money there, they spend a ton. The issue is how do they spend it and what, if anything, do they get back in terms of ROI from that
Hmm.
training. But because you hired your problems, you need to be more rigorous in that process. And the reality is, many sales managers are not. And here I'll just talk about one or two things not to do and then things
Mm.
to do. In general, and by the way, what I am about to say, Phil, is as close to an established fact as anything you will ever hear from a management professor. And yet I find executives resist this fact.
Okay.
And the fact is this: managers across functions, but especially busy sales managers, tend to vastly overestimate their ability to judge somebody's work skills and their fit with the company based on a few unstructured interviews. This is a repeated finding from over 60 years of research. In fact, there are studies, and I'm talking about good studies. I'm not talking about these anecdotes about, hey, when I was hiring for Oracle or something like that.
Yeah.
There are studies that actually indicate a negative correlation between interviews and actual subsequent on the job performance. In other words, the company would have been better simply picking at resumes at random while blindfolded. So think about what I'm saying. It's an inherently tough job, and many managers, especially busy sales managers, tend to make a tough job needlessly tougher by simply relying on a few interviews. Now, what do you do about that? The first thing is know what you're hiring for. All right. Again,
Hmm.
sales is very context specific. Probably the most common criterion cited by managers in sales hiring is experience. We're looking
Yeah.
for someone with experience. Now, first of all, that's a very, very ambiguous variable. What do we mean by experience? Is it experience selling to this particular customer group? Is it experience in this product category, et cetera, et cetera? So the way to get better at hiring is first requiring, and I mean you've got to require it, requiring the hiring managers to specify what they mean by experience and what is it about the buying process that makes that kind of experience important. Most important thing about selling is the buyer, not the seller.
Hmm.
That's where you start. And then I think the second thing, and this is an area where sales managers can control what I'm about to say, but too often they don't. What I have found throughout my career when I work with companies, and I have worked with lots and lots of companies. I don't have to be humble about that. When I ask people running sales forces, what are you looking for to hire? What I most often get is a list of attributes that only Leonardo da Vinci or Michelangelo could qualify for.
Hmm.
And I always say the same thing. Whenever you can hire Michelangelo, do it. I'm sure he'll do a great job on the ceiling. He's a genius. But there are very, very few Renaissance men and women out there. Now, what do you do about that? You understand your buyer, your sales model, and you allocate your available resources in such a way that you don't need Michelangelo for the job. You can hire Frank Cespedes, someone who's reasonably bright, but is no genius. That's what you do when you say, this is what I want sales to do versus marketing or service or product or social media. And that is a sales manager's responsibility, but too often they don't accept that responsibility and basically revert back to get me somebody who's really, really great and I'll sell more. Well, I'm sure that's true, but that's not exactly a strategy.
One of the comments you make in that first chapter is about, whether you go out and try and recruit in the top performing salespeople from another company. And I think you challenge that notion because their context could be quite different, I think, to the context of the
Yeah.
organization for whom you
Yeah,
work.
no, that's right. I challenge it, but again, I want to challenge it with the appropriate nuance.
Yeah.
Talent matters in sales. All right. This is again supported again and again by the data. In most companies, especially B2B companies, in most companies, the top 10 to 15% of the sales force is usually not a little bit better than the average person in that same sales force. I'm talking about comparing it to the average, not the bottom quintile. It's usually orders of magnitude hire. We talk about the 80-20 rule in the customer base. It's about a 90-10 rule in the sales force. So talent matters, but it's talent in your company, selling your product at your price. Most sales managers have had the experience of hiring someone who was clearly a star at another company,
Mm,
and somehow when she gets to our company, she's no longer a star. Now, step back and think about that. It's not as though that person suddenly got stupid or lost their individual capabilities. There is no such thing as sales performance in the abstract. That's a Platonic abstraction. There's only performance in our company, with our strategy, with our products. And part of the job of the hiring manager, the sales manager, is to accelerate the necessary knowledge and socialization. That's what we call ramp up time in
hmm.
sales. And, too many sales managers take a passive attitude toward that. No, part of your job as a leader is to accelerate that process. So, yes, talent matters, but it's only talent in our context.
Yeah, I think if you look at the economics of getting it right and getting it wrong, they're quite startling. And the cost of recruitment, the cost of the time for ramp up, all of those costs per person is huge. And if you link that back to the comment you made right at the very beginning, which is the fact that sales managers don't spend enough time really thinking through this process. Why do you think it is? Why do you think it is if so often they get it wrong that they fall, people fall into repeating,
Yeah,
perhaps the same kind of way of recruiting,
yeah.
given,
Well,
the financial implications, it's a massive issue.
yeah. Well, part of it is the generic transition from being the doer to the manager or leader. And again, this what I'm about to say is true in all functions, but especially relevant in sales. When you're the doer, when you're the salesperson, you learn to take care of yourself and your customers, right? And
Hmm.
that's important. Most sales managers are picked from good salespeople. And by the way, I don't think that's an irrational
Yeah.
choice. Being a sales manager, you're affecting people's compensation, promotion. In my view, you need to give them good, candid performance evaluations. You need credibility to do that, right? You've got to be
Yeah.
someone who the salespeople perceive as having been there, done that sort of thing. So it's not an irrelevant criterion, but you've got to learn to be a manager. So that's one reason. Um, but the other reason I think is built in to the nature of sales in business. Salespeople always talk a good game about
Hmm.
change and innovation. They always
Yeah.
do. We're cool. Look at the way I dress. I'm in favor of change. But the reality is, it's among the most change resistant functions in most companies. And it's not because of the genetic structure of sales managers. So many other resource allocation decisions in any company depend on sales forecasts and the ability of the sales group to make those numbers. Other functions, hiring decisions, capacity decisions, operations decisions, etc. So as a result, what the other functions want from sales: predictability, make your numbers, not only every year, but every quarter, every month, every week, because it affects what I'm
Hmm.
doing. The metrics in sales tend to reinforce that, right?
Right.
What is it like this month? And as a result, despite the rhetoric, what many sales managers learn is that even when change can mean something better down the road, stick with the devil I know, because I don't want to incur the transition costs. By the way, that's how companies get disrupted. I mean, that's
Yeah.
exactly what happens. But again, there's a systemic reason for this. It's not
That's
just, geez, I don't like to change. Nobody likes to change. That's not really the diagnosis.
yeah. It's so interesting you brought up this issue of change and some of the forces that restrict an ability to kind of change and innovation. When we look at systems of sales management on our sales masters programs, we look at systems for managing the business of selling, and we also look at systems for sales transformation. So believing that you need a different kind of mindset, you know, is what we're trying to do to create a faster caterpillar, or are we trying to transform to a butterfly, you know, with how we want to kind of grow and manage the business of selling. Um, and it's quite interesting that we find when we have conversations with sales leaders about this topic of change, which you've rightly brought up. Um, I'm just intrigued with your comment that actually it's one of the functions that's least able to change, perhaps for the reasons that you've given. I think that's a really insightful comment, and it's making me feel that sometimes the system of how a business is run is stopping sales from being able to kind of rethink the way that it is going to manage its business and to innovate along the lines of what you said. I think that's great.
Yeah.
What I like about your style of writing is that some of your comments are quite provocative. You know, like you talk about, you know, the inability um, to assess probability. You know, for example, you talk about you know, concepts like hire for the task, not the title. I mean, you know, it's just quite challenging questions, and I think that what makes the chapters come alive is actually, you know, some of these little quotes you put into the book that certainly made me sit up and think a bit about the topic that you're writing about. You hire your problems, you know, a comment you made earlier. You hide your problem. Really interesting. So yeah. For those out there who haven't kind of picked up the book, I really recommend that you do so. But can we move on to the next topic of compensation? Because I think that most sales managers that we speak to are kind of play around with the compensation systems. And use it to tweak, you know, behavior in the right direction. And I've rarely found sales managers entirely happy with the compensation systems that they've set up. So I suppose I'm going to start off with this question. Do you think that paying salespeople a performance related incentive is a good thing or a bad thing?
Oh, I think it's a good thing. And again, sales is context specific, so I don't want to make a blanket statement, but I'll say significantly more than 50% of the time, it's not only a good thing, it is a necessary thing for a couple of reasons that the data will show you. First of all, sales in almost any business context, you're going to hear no more often than you hear yes when it comes to making the sale. So there has to be an incentive to stick with it. And one of the things I find that many people who haven't actually been in sales systematically underestimate is the importance of persistence in sales. All right. Now that's a two-edged sword because you can't, no doesn't mean no the first, second, or third time, but at a certain point it means no. And if you
Hmm.
keep doing that, you commit what the accountants call the sunk cost fallacy, right? Throwing good money after bad. But persistence counts. You will see this. I mean, you'll see some of the data in the book. Inside sales, what the research tells us is you've got to reach out about 6 or 7 times before you get a response. And most salespeople and inside sales forces give up after 3 times. So again, we
Hmm.
need an incentive to keep them doing that. But I would argue again that compensation, while it's important, is a necessary but not sufficient cause of getting the results you want. So, yes, uh, think through the compensation plan and the incentive part, the commission part in particular, but don't do what a number of managers do. We have this horrible phrase in sales. We talk about coin operated sales forces to use
Yeah.
that phrase. I mean, think about that, talking about human beings as vending machines. But what's behind that phrase? What's behind that phrase is this illusion. Trust me, as someone who ran a business for 11 years, I wish this were true. It's not. But this illusion that if I just get the incentive structure right, it's going to work on its own. No, it doesn't. Managers must manage performance reviews, performance evaluations, non financial recognition, in addition to getting the basic incentive system right as well.
Mm.
So, yeah, I believe in commissions, but commissions by themselves are not the answer to anything.
Yeah. No, I agree, but I'm very often struck by the focus that sales managers have about only doing only doing things that are going to drive, the commission structure process, sort of, and that could be a good thing. It could lead to persistence, but it could also lead to a kind of behavior that's not in the best interest of the company. They could become very silo focused, for example. They're not looking at taking holistic solutions to clients because they're just
No,
focused on that.
I agree with
Yeah.
that, Phil, but I disagree with what I do now think is a big body of opinion that says, therefore, when it comes to incentives and compensation, as they say in New York, forget about it. No, I don't. I
Mm,
don't agree with that. Again, a necessary but not sufficient cause. Of course, certain people are going to become siloed or even excessively short-term oriented, but those people will do that for lots of reasons beyond how they're getting paid.
yeah.
So yeah, nothing's perfect, but we live in this world. We don't live in the next world. Business is about
Yeah.
what happens on earth, not the afterlife.
Yeah. I think the other comment that I'd like to make is that compensation quite often lags behind strategy, meaning that um, you may have organizations have a particular goal to move from, say, on-premise. If we're talking about tech, the tech market in particular, on-premise to cloud-based solutions. But actually, the incentives, the way that the sales behavior is driven, is rewarding more the on-premise kind of sales,
Yeah,
not cloud. Eventually the system catches up, but you can see that organizations are sort of desperate to get some shift in the way that the sales team sell. But I'm quite often surprised at the fact that the compensation package, which is critical, is often not quite aligned, and it
yeah,
causes
yeah.
frustrations in
Same would be
execution.
true about many cross-selling initiatives,
Correct.
right?
Yeah, correct.
But I think again, it's important to understand why that happens. I mean, it's not lack of IQ. That
Yeah,
is not, I think,
yeah, yeah.
what's going at stake. What's at stake. It gets me back to that central role of sales. There's you may or may not be aware of what some people call the monkey theory of strategy. I've heard
Okay.
managers refer to this. And the notion is this: the smart monkey making its way through the competitive jungle doesn't let go of one branch, that is, one source of operating income,
Right.
until it has its other hand on the next branch. Because if that monkey swings and misses, there's a predator who says, that's not a monkey, that's lunch. Now, that is a metaphor for change, all right? And we know what most companies do. They hang on to the first branch until somebody cuts it off. But the interesting thing is that if you actually look at videos of monkeys swinging through the jungle, there is a period of time where they, in fact, are in midair. But the smart monkey can calibrate the distance. The
Mm.
same is true in compensation. You know, we talk about transformation very often as though it's about shutting off this faucet and turning on that. That's not the way it
Hmm.
usually works. You've got to make the pivot while still generating the cash for whatever is the new engine. That's why the issue of experimentation, testing, and sales is
Mm.
so important, and why, by the way, it's increasingly a requirement for good sales leaders there. And testing in business is not like running a clinical trial or writing a statistically significant academic paper. It's a messier, but that doesn't mean unstructured activity. So, yeah, there's often this divergence, but not because people are stupid, because they've got to continue to generate money while they build the next business. No,
Correct.
that's why I like being an academic again. It's fun. Running a business is real work.
It is, yeah, but combining both, I think, is the ideal ideal scenario. When we talk about compensation, and we focused a little bit on financial compensation, but you also talk about non-financial. You know, it's not just about the commission, but non-financial incentive programs. Do you want to comment on those? And you know, when I think you link it a bit about, you know, perhaps back to purpose as well, but what sort of non-financial motivational incentive programs have you seen to be successful?
Well, you know, I think I quote this in the book, but it's something I heard a manager say years and years ago, a sales manager. He said, we work for pay, but we strive for recognition. You
Yeah,
see what he was getting at.
of
And
course.
this, I think, is particularly important in sales. Sales is very, very much a social activity.
It is.
Right?
Yeah.
In general, people want to know where they stand. But in sales, because of the number of rejections, etc., your ego, as they say, is on the line
Yeah.
almost daily. So it's not a coincidence that so many companies for centuries, when someone makes a sale, quite rightly make a big deal out of it. They ring the bell, you know, we clap,
Yeah.
etc. That's an important element of non-financial recognition. So
Yeah.
that's number one. Number two, and this gets us to how salespeople develop. And you know, look, as academics, I hope it's okay for us to say this, but what the research indicates is that the vast majority of salespeople learn the most, not from courses, not from
Hmm.
training seminars. They learn from watching the best of their peers in action. The
Yeah.
learning theorists call this modeling behavior, and it's very important in sales. I watch you and I say, wow, Phil, the way you dealt with that price objection, that I'm going to use that. The way
Hmm.
you framed the value proposition, that was clever. That's also part of non-financial recognition, and
Yeah.
it disseminates best practice. And then thirdly, I think there's a wider leadership um, lesson here. Talent matters in sales. It matters in sales arguably more than most other business functions. All right.
Mm.
That's what the data shows you. But any company and any manager must be worthy of talent. All right.
Yeah.
Very often you'll find people in sales in particular say, well, training, development, we train them, we build them, and then they go somewhere else. Our best people go somewhere else. And I always say the same thing. What's your alternative? You want to work with dummies? I mean, how
Mm.
long do you want to work with someone who's talented? 5 years, 5 months, 5 minutes? The answer is as long as you can get it
Yeah.
there. You want to be a talent magnet. And a lot of that is not simply the way you get paid.
Yeah.
Turnover in sales in the US runs between 20 and 30% annually. Remarkably
Mm.
consistent number. And in strong economic conditions, people with talent have more options. And you're not going to stop their
Yeah.
options. they are going to get offered more. So non-financial recognitions are very, very important.
Yeah. No, I agree. And I think that, it's very interesting when you start to link, it's about purpose as well. It's not just about sort of non-financial incentives, but it's, to do with culture and what the organization stands for and how it acts and so on.
Yeah.
It's a very important
You know that
aspect.
the old phrase, culture eats strategy for
Strategy,
breakfast. It's
yes.
not true. Culture eats strategy for breakfast, lunch, and
And
dinner.
dinner. By the way, who came up with that quote? There's a lot of argument about who did. Was it Michael Porter that came up with it, or was it someone
I
else?
doubt it. I know Mike. He's a friend. He wasn't interested in culture. He was in a
Okay. I'll have to look it up because I see conflicting points of view on it, but I do agree with it. Can you make a really interesting comment in the chapter on compensation about transparency of pay? And you, I think you suggested it's important that it is transparent. Do you think you could elaborate on that a little bit about why you think it's important? Because, there's some organizations who have written into the contracts, don't share your remuneration kind of system with anyone else. It's something that's private.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I think a couple of things. One is, in my experience, both in the firm I ran, working with other companies, and now I have a junior colleague who's, her research suggests that
Yeah.
what I experienced anecdotally, again, is pretty pervasive. Word about how people get paid makes itself known in the organization.
Yeah.
What we call the jungle telegraph is
Yes.
alive and well. So, at one level, the issue is, do I want to be proactive about this or not? What does it mean to say to somebody, don't talk about your pay? At least in the United States, you can't do that legally. All right.
Yeah.
So first, let's face
Yeah.
reality, I guess, would be comment number one. And comment number two is, if you assume that this data gets out there, I think being transparent about this also forces managers and leaders to get better at a number of the other things that we've been talking about during this podcast. When people know about their pay, especially in sales versus X, what's the first reaction to most people? How come she's getting more than
Mm.
I am? And that forces the manager to come up with the data and the criteria. She gets paid more because she accomplishes more. She
Yeah.
sells more, or her EBITDA is better, etc. So I think there's a knock-on
Yeah.
effect in other areas. But this notion that somehow, we can sort of make compensation, I don't know, a taboo subject like sex, I just don't think that's organizational
Mm.
reality. So,
Yeah.
as managers, let's deal with reality, and let's deal with it in a way that it's very, very productive for all
Yeah.
of us.
Um, you talk about the concept of fairness, which I found really interesting as well. And you talk about interactional fairness, procedural fairness, and distributive fairness. Do you mind talking me through why have you looked at fairness across those three kind of topics
Yeah.
and as it relates to compensation as well?
Yeah, and the type of fairness that I'm emphasizing there is not distributive fairness. That's
Right.
about outcomes. All right, I'm
Okay.
talking about procedural fairness.
Okay.
All right, and here we have research. I want to know if I'm being treated differently or being paid differently, etc. Why is that? Right? I mean, think about salespeople. What is the most common response that you hear from a salesperson who's not making his or her numbers? My leads are terrible. All right.
Yeah.
Well, okay, let's look at the way we distribute leads. In many organizations, it's basically a round robin. It's statistically very unlikely that every time we do that, Charlie, you lose the lottery. All right. So there's got
Yeah.
to
Yeah.
be others are
Yeah.
doing well with the leads. That's an element of procedural fairness. The other, I think, is the general human tendency. Psychologists call this the fundamental fallacy. If something good happens, it's my fault. If something bad happens, it's everybody else's
Yeah.
fault. I did research about this years ago. The issue of compensation in team selling. All right, we split the commission because you and I were both involved
Yeah.
with that. And what you found in that research is the fundamental fallacy was alive and well. That somehow, when I have to split it 50% with you, I didn't get 50%, I lost 50%. So
Right.
again, procedural fairness and the reality of
Yeah.
procedural fairness, not just the rhetoric, is very, very important because at the end of the day, sales is done for the most part by people with people.
Yeah.
And we're not going to redo, a couple of 100,000 years of human evolution. This is the way we are wired, certainly for this generation and this century. Managers have to deal with that, and to sort of pretend that we can just do it through incentives or we can just do it this way.
Mm.
That's just not the way business works.
We had quite an interesting discussion with a group of students last week on the topic of ethics in the way they manage people, and he brought a dilemma. We asked them to bring dilemmas, and the dilemma was this: that they had a client, an international client, who didn't want to purchase the products through the individual countries across Europe. And they wanted to be able to purchase the products and services through the London office. And he happened to be in the London office. And he realized that if he brought all of the sales that currently were being managed across the different countries, that he would then get compensated on a project that's much larger than he would have done otherwise. And they had a procedure inside the organization, which is if you are going to shift something like this inside the organization, you need to let everyone know in the organization what's happening. But he timed the information for a late on a Friday afternoon, before the weekend, and when there was a bank holiday the following Monday. And I think within the procedure was the fact that you need to, if you object to something like this happening, you've got 2 or 3 days basically to object. And it was just it just provoked a lot of conversation about the way compensation systems drive behavior. And like you say, so much of sales is about a collaborative effort. And we talked about the impact of how his behavior will be seen by other team members in other countries in the future, and whether that would be, whether his decision to do what he's done would be in his best interest in the long term. In the short
Yeah.
term, he'll end up with a bigger paycheck. In the long term, perhaps he won't. I don't know, Frank, if you've come across that sort of thing before,
Oh
but
yeah, yeah. And
okay.
but I'd frame the the issue a bit differently. For me, that's not so much an ethical dilemma.
Okay.
It is ultimately a strategic dilemma. I mean, first of all, if this big customer, who presumably is a profitable customer, we
Yeah.
want to do business with them, if they want to buy this way and not that way, I don't think it's unethical to say, "Hey, you're the customer, buy this way." All right,
Correct.
that's
Yeah. Yeah.
number one. Number two is, gee, is there something sneaky and deceptive about waiting until 4 p.m. on Friday? And my answer is both yes and no. And I don't mean to be paradoxical
Yeah.
about that, Phil. On the one hand, it's obviously yes, right? Geez, I'm doing this. I don't want you to know. But B, if in fact the organization is anywhere near a decent organization, you and I both know what's going to happen next time.
Yeah.
That guy's not going to get the lead. his
Yeah.
colleagues. I mean, so if he or she is not smart enough to understand that, I don't consider that an ethical failing. In fact, I consider it something worse, a managerial
Right.
failing.
How
But
interesting.
the third issue is the company should presumably have some policy about this. And I don't think I don't think a good policy is for that person to say,
Yeah.
gee, I don't want to anger my colleagues, therefore I'm not going to accommodate your buying. That's a
Yeah.
good way to lose business.
Yeah.
But
So
again,
interesting.
I see this more or less as business issues which people get paid to manage. I
Yeah.
don't see it as something we need to read Immanuel Kant about.
Yeah.
The ethics part of this is a great thing about business. It's more or less self-policing. You
Yeah.
know, what's that wonderful phrase we use in America? Fool me once, it's your fault. Fool me twice, it's my fault. I
Right.
think that's the
Okay.
lesson of that particular anecdote.
That's great. Well, I think we're Frank. I'm not sure how we're doing with time, but my guess is we're probably nearing the time to round things up. But I just want to say, Frank, it's been an absolute pleasure talking to you. And thanks so much for sharing your insights about the book. The book will be in the show notes that we'll have associated with the Sales Transformation Podcast channel. But I do hope that we managed to entice you back again for another conversation at some point. We don't want to monopolize your time because I know you're incredibly busy, but very grateful that you've been with us on this session today. So thank you.
Bill, it's a deal. It's a pleasure speaking with you. You make it, as they now say, user friendly. And I'm sure you've discovered this at this point in your career. You reach a certain point. Sales is a very, very good example of this. You reach a certain point where, if you're completely honest with yourself, you find yourself getting impatient speaking with people who have no idea what they're talking about around the topic. So when you do meet someone with that experience and knowledge, it's a pleasure. And
Oh,
I thank you very, very much for inviting me.
thank you, Frank.